My name is Scarlett, and I need to tell you about the day my life split cleanly into before and after. It was a Tuesday in late September when my husband of 7 years threw me out of our house like I was nothing more than rubbish he'd been meaning to take to the curb for weeks. I suppose in his mind that's exactly what I had become after all those years of trying to be the wife he wanted, instead of the woman I actually was. I met Marcus at university when I was 21 and foolish enough to believe that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. He was charming in that way that dangerous men often are, and I was grieving my grandmother Eleanor, who had raised me at Thornfield Estate after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. Marcus made me feel like I could be normal and ordinary, instead of the girl from the big crumbling manor house who never quite fitted in anywhere. So when he asked me to marry him, I said yes, and when he suggested we distance ourselves from my inheritance, I agreed because I wanted to prove that I loved him for himself and not because I needed my family's money or legacy. 7 years I spent in that rented semi-detached house in a suburb that looked exactly like every other suburb in England. 7 years of cooking his meals and ironing his shirts and listening to him complain about his job, while my own dreams of painting and managing the estate my grandmother had loved slowly died from neglect. 7 years of becoming quieter and smaller and less like myself, until I barely recognized the woman staring back at me from the bathroom mirror each morning. The day it happened started like any other day in that house of slow suffocation. Marcus came home from work in a foul mood because his boss had criticized a report he'd written, and I made the mistake of burning the chicken I'd been roasting for dinner. It was a small thing really, but it became the spark that lit 7 years of his accumulated resentment. He exploded with a violence I'd seen building for months but had convinced myself wasn't really there. The shouting started in the kitchen and followed me through every room as I tried to escape the venom pouring from his mouth. He'd been mentioning Claire from his office more and more lately, always with that particular tone men use when they're trying to make you jealous while pretending they're doing nothing wrong. That evening it all came spilling out in a torrent of cruelty that would have broken the younger version of me into pieces. "You're useless," he screamed as he grabbed my suitcase from the cupboard under the stairs and began throwing my clothes into it with no care for what he was packing or destroying. 7 years I've wasted on you, and what have you given me? Nothing. You can't even cook a simple dinner without ruining it. Claire makes me feel alive in ways you never could. I stood in the hallway watching this man I'd once loved dismantle our marriage with his bare hands, and the strangest thing happened. Instead of crying or begging or trying to reason with him, I felt something cold and clear settle over me like a sheet of ice. It was dignity, I suppose, or perhaps it was simply that I'd finally reached the bottom of how small I could make myself and discovered there was nowhere left to go but up. The neighbours had gathered in their doorways and windows by the time Marcus dragged my suitcase to the front door. Mrs. Peterson from next door had her hand over her mouth in horror, and Mr. Chen across the street was filming on his mobile phone. Marcus didn't care about the audience. He wanted witnesses to my humiliation, proof that he'd been the one to discard me rather than the other way around. "Go to your sister's house," he spat, even though he knew perfectly well I didn't have a sister. "Go anywhere. I don't care where you go as long as it's far away from me. I've found someone better than you, and she's moving in by the weekend." Then he slammed the door so hard the glass panel rattled in its frame, and I was standing on the pavement with my hastily packed suitcase and my dignity wrapped around me like armor. The neighbors were staring and whispering, and I knew this would be the talk of the street for months to come. Poor Scarlett, thrown out by her husband for a younger woman from his office. How humiliating. How tragic. But as I pulled out my mobile and rang for a taxi, my hands were perfectly steady. The driver arrived within 10 minutes and loaded my suitcase into the boot while I settled into the back seat. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, and when he asked where I needed to go, I heard myself say something I hadn't planned or rehearsed. "To my estate, please." The words felt strange in my mouth after 7 years of pretending I didn't come from somewhere that mattered. The driver nodded as if people asked to be driven to their estates every day, and we pulled away from that suffocating suburb while Marcus watched from behind the curtains I'd chosen and hung myself. The drive took 3 hours through the darkening countryside, and with every mile I felt something loosening in my chest. My mobile started buzzing about an hour into the journey with calls and messages from Marcus, but I didn't answer. I watched the numbers pile up on the screen and felt nothing but a distant curiosity about what could possibly have changed in 60 minutes to make him suddenly desperate to reach me. It was nearly midnight when we finally turned down the long tree-lined drive I hadn't seen in 15 years. Thornfield Estate rose up before me in the moonlight, its Georgian facade crumbling and beautiful and heartbreakingly familiar. The iron gates were rusted and the gardens were wild, but it was home in a way that rented semi-detached house had never been. I paid the driver and stood there with my suitcase at my feet, staring up at the house my grandmother had loved and I had abandoned. My mobile was still buzzing with Marcus's increasingly frantic calls, and I knew without looking that he'd finally discovered the truth about the house he'd thrown me out of. It was rented in my name. The lease ended in 30 days. And I'd just arrived at the ancestral estate he'd convinced me to walk away from because he couldn't bear to live in my family's shadow. I switched off my mobile and picked up my suitcase, and for the first time in 7 years, I smiled with something that felt remarkably like freedom. The morning light filtering through Thornfield's grimy windows was kinder than I'd expected, softening the decay into something almost romantic. I walked through rooms I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral 8 years ago, and every step brought back memories I'd worked hard to bury beneath the weight of trying to be Marcus's perfect wife. The library still smelled of old leather and Eleanor's lavender perfume, though dust covered every surface like a shroud. Her books lined the walls exactly as she'd left them, organized by subject rather than author because she'd always said that knowledge should be grouped by purpose, not by accident of who'd written it down. I ran my fingers along the spines and felt 15 years of distance collapsing into nothing. This was where she'd taught me about the estate after my parents died, sitting me down with ledgers and maps and patient explanations about tenant farmers and land management and the responsibility that came with inherited privilege. I'd loved those lessons once, loved feeling connected to something larger than myself. Then I'd met Marcus and convinced myself that loving him meant leaving all of this behind. The East Wing was worse than I'd remembered. Water damage had turned the ceiling into a canvas of brown stains, and I could see daylight through gaps in the roof tiles. The morning room where Eleanor had taken her tea every afternoon at 4 o'clock was filled with furniture covered in dust sheets, looking like ghosts waiting for someone to remember they'd once been real. I found her journals in the library that afternoon, tucked behind a complete set of Dickens on the third shelf from the floor. 20 years of daily entries written in her precise handwriting, documenting everything from crop rotations to village gossip to her own thoughts about loss and resilience. The most recent entry was dated 3 days before she died. "Scarlett will come home when she's ready," she'd written. "I only hope I'm still here to see it, but if I'm not, I trust she'll find her way back to herself eventually. The women in our family always do, even when it takes them longer than it should." I sat on the dusty floor of the library and cried for the first time since Marcus had thrown me out, not for the marriage I'd lost but for the years I'd wasted being someone I wasn't. Eleanor had known I'd made a mistake, had known I'd come back eventually, and she'd kept Thornfield waiting for me even though I hadn't deserved that faith. The estate solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, arrived that evening with a briefcase full of documents and a sympathetic expression that suggested he'd already heard about my dramatic exit from married life. He'd been Eleanor's friend for 40 years, and he looked at me with the same disappointed concern she would have shown if she'd lived to see me marry Marcus in the first place. "Your grandmother established a trust," he explained, spreading papers across the library desk. "Thornfield remained in trust after her death, with me as executor. The income from tenant farms has covered basic maintenance, but only just. The property needs significant investment, Scarlett. We're talking about £200,000 minimum to make it structurally sound." The number hung in the air between us like a challenge. I had perhaps £5,000 in savings, carefully squirreled away in an account Marcus hadn't known about. Everything else had been in his name during the marriage, another foolish decision I'd made to prove my love didn't depend on my family's money. "The good news," Mr. Pemberton continued, "is that Thornfield was never marital property. Your husband has no claim to it whatsoever, regardless of what he might threaten." That evening I walked into the village pub, needing to see what remained of the community I'd abandoned 15 years ago. The Red Lion hadn't changed, still all dark wood and brass fixtures and the smell of chips and beer. Conversations died when I entered, then resumed at a lower volume thick with speculation. I ordered a gin and tonic and sat at the bar, pretending not to hear the whispers from the corner booth. "That's the estate girl," someone said. "Married some nobody and thought she was too good for us. Heard he threw her out for another woman. Serves her right, really." The words stung less than they should have, perhaps because part of me agreed with them. I had abandoned Thornfield and the people who depended on it, had chosen Marcus's suburban dream over Eleanor's legacy. Whatever sympathy I might have received had been spent long ago. But then the landlord, Tom, who'd known me since I was 8 years old, set down my drink and said quietly, "Your grandmother never stopped talking about you, you know. Always said you'd come back when you were ready." Glad she was right, even if she didn't live to see it. I walked back to Thornfield through the darkening lanes, my decision crystallizing with every step. I wouldn't just survive this. I wouldn't just live in this crumbling house and accept charity from tenant farmers and wait for the roof to finally collapse. I would rebuild Thornfield into something magnificent, something Eleanor would have been proud of, something that proved I was more than the woman Marcus had discarded like rubbish. My mobile had 43 missed calls from Marcus by the time I switched it back on, and 17 increasingly desperate text messages. The last one simply said, "We need to talk." I made a mistake. I deleted them all without reading them properly, and for the first time since I'd said yes to his proposal 7 years ago, I went to sleep feeling something remarkably like hope. Marcus appeared at Thornfield's gates 3 days after I'd arrived, driving the BMW he leased to impress colleagues he claimed to despise. I watched him from the library window as he pressed the rusted intercom button repeatedly, his face twisted with that particular combination of rage and panic I'd seen so many times during our marriage. The difference was that now I felt nothing watching him lose control except a distant, clinical curiosity. I walked down the long drive in my grandmother's old Barber jacket and Wellington boots, taking my time because making him wait felt like the first small act of reclamation I'd allowed myself in 7 years. By the time I reached the gates, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel and a vein throbbed visibly in his temple. "Open the gate, Scarlett," he demanded through the car window. "We need to talk about this like adults." "We can talk perfectly well with the gate closed," I replied, my voice steady in a way that clearly surprised him. "What do you want, Marcus?" He climbed out of the car, and I noticed for the first time how ordinary he looked without the pedestal I'd spent 7 years building under him. Average height, thinning hair, a stomach that strained against his cheap suit jacket. This was the man I'd made myself small for, and the realization would have been funny if it hadn't been so desperately sad. "I made a mistake," he said, trying the charm that had worked on 21-year-old me. "Claire means nothing, Scarlett. She's just a distraction. You and I, we have history. We have a home together." "Had," I corrected. "Had a home. The lease ends in 27 days. I've already notified the landlord I won't be renewing." The color drained from his face as the full weight of his situation finally penetrated his self-absorption. "You can't do that. Where am I supposed to live?" "I imagine that's between you and Claire," I said. "Or perhaps you could ask your sister if her sofa is still available." He gripped the gate bars like a prisoner, and something ugly twisted his features into a mask I barely recognized. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Coming back to your fancy estate, playing the grand lady. But I know the truth, Scarlett. I know you're nothing without me. You'll come crawling back within a month when you realize you can't manage on your own." "Then I suppose we'll both find out soon enough," I replied. That's when he shifted tactics to threats, his voice rising to the volume I remembered from 100 arguments I'd always lost by giving in. "I'll fight you for half of this place. Marital assets, Scarlett. 7 years of marriage means I'm entitled to half of everything you own." A black Mercedes pulled up behind Marcus's BMW before I could respond, and Mr. Pemberton emerged with his briefcase and the expression of a man who'd dealt with bullies for 4 decades. He walked past Marcus without acknowledgement and stood beside me on my side of the gate. "Mr. Ashford," he said pleasantly, "I'm Gerald Pemberton, Mrs. Ashford's solicitor. I feel I should inform you that Thornfield Estate was held in trust throughout the marriage and therefore never constituted marital property. Any legal action you pursue will be both unsuccessful and expensive. Now if you'll excuse us, Mrs. Ashford and I have estate business to discuss." Marcus looked between us, searching for weakness and finding none. For 7 years I'd given him my weakness like a gift he'd never appreciated. Now he was discovering that the well had finally run dry. "This isn't over," he said, climbing back into his leased BMW with as much dignity as he could salvage from complete humiliation. "You'll regret this, Scarlett." I watched him drive away down the lane, and when Mr. Pemberton asked if I was all right, I realized I was better than all right. I was free. That evening I found a note tucked into one of Eleanor's journals, written in her handwriting and dated the month before she died. "For Scarlett, when she's ready to come home," it said. "You were never lost, my darling. You were just taking the long way round." I cried again, but this time the tears felt like relief. The true scale of Thornfield's decay revealed itself gradually, like a wound unwrapping layer by layer. I spent the first week cataloguing damage with James Hartley, the estate manager who'd kept everything from complete collapse during the years I'd been playing house with Marcus in suburban mediocrity. James was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, somewhere in his mid-40s with weathered hands and eyes that assessed everything with unsettling precision. He'd worked for Eleanor for 15 years, and his loyalty to her memory translated into barely concealed skepticism about me. "The roof needs complete replacement on the east wing," he said, making notes on a clipboard as we stood in what had once been the morning room. "Another 20,000 at least. Then there's the damp in the south wall, the electrics that haven't been updated since the 70s, and the heating system that's held together with hope and rust." I did the mathematics in my head and felt my grandmother's modest savings evaporating before we'd even started. "How much total?" 200,000 if we're lucky, James replied, meeting my eyes with a directness that felt like a challenge. "Closer to 300 if we're honest. And that's just to make it structurally sound, never mind turning it into something that could actually generate income." "Eleanor trusted you to keep this place running," I said quietly. "Why did you stay when I didn't?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "Because I promised her I would. Even when her granddaughter couldn't be bothered to come home for more than a funeral." The words were brutal in their honesty, and I respected him more for not sugarcoating my failures. "I can't change the past, James. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." "I've heard that before," he said, but there was less hostility in his voice than there had been a moment earlier. My mobile buzzed constantly with messages from Marcus that alternated between pathetic and threatening, sometimes within the same paragraph. Claire had apparently left him after discovering he'd been evicted from the rental house, and he was currently sleeping on his sister's sofa in Croydon, which he seemed to think was somehow my fault. I blocked his number after the 15th message and felt nothing except relief at the silence that followed. Nina called that evening, my university friend who'd stayed loyal through 7 years of me slowly disappearing into Marcus's shadow. She was an events planner in London now, successful and sharp and exactly the kind of woman I'd stopped allowing myself to be. "I'm coming to see this estate," she announced without preamble. "And I'm bringing wine, because from what you've told me, you're going to need it." She arrived 2 days later in a vintage Jaguar, all designer clothes and infectious energy, and walked through Thornfield's rooms with the eye of someone who saw potential instead of decay. "This is incredible, Scarlett. Do you know what people would pay to have weddings here? Events. I could market this place properly, turn it into something really special." We sat in the library that night, sharing a bottle of wine Eleanor had been saving for an occasion she hadn't lived to see, and I admitted things I'd never said aloud during the marriage. I stopped painting. I stopped having opinions about anything that mattered. I became so small I barely existed, and I convinced myself that's what love looked like. Nina took my hand across Eleanor's mahogany desk. "Love isn't supposed to shrink you, darling. It's supposed to give you room to grow." The next morning, James found me in the East Wing and delivered news that felt like a physical blow. Structural engineers' report came back. "The damage is worse than we thought. The entire wing is unsafe. We'll need to shore it up before winter, or we risk losing it completely." I looked at the numbers on his clipboard and felt the weight of impossible choices settling onto my shoulders. Thornfield needed £400,000 to survive, and I had barely 5,000 in savings and dreams that felt increasingly foolish in the harsh light of mathematics. But I'd made a promise to Eleanor's memory and to myself, and I'd spent 7 years learning what happened when you broke promises that mattered. Then we'd better start working, I said. The bank manager looked at me across his desk with the particular blend of pity and condescension reserved for women with no credit history asking for significant loans. I'd spent 7 years with everything in Marcus's name, playing house with his permission, and now I was paying the price for that willful erasure of my own financial existence. Mrs. Ashford, he said, glancing at papers that told the story of my economic invisibility, without employment history or assets beyond the estate itself, which frankly is more liability than asset at present, I'm afraid we can't approve a loan of this magnitude. I walked out of that bank in Cheltenham feeling the humiliation of dependence catching up with me like a debt I'd been accruing interest on for years. Marcus had controlled every penny during our marriage, and I'd let him because I was trying to prove my love didn't depend on Eleanor's money. Now I had an estate worth millions on paper and couldn't afford to fix a leaking roof. James was waiting in the estate's ancient Land Rover, and he took one look at my face and said nothing, which I appreciated more than any platitude would have warranted. We drove out to visit the tenant farmers, something Eleanor had done monthly and I hadn't bothered with in 15 years. Mrs. Ashford, no relation despite the shared surname, was 73 and had been farming her 100 acres since before I was born. She served tea in her spotless kitchen and studied me with eyes that missed nothing. "Your gran talked about you constantly," she said, pouring Earl Grey into china cups that had probably been in her family as long as Thornfield had been in mine. "Always hoping you'd come home, even when the rest of us had written you off as lost to that husband of yours." The bluntness stung, but I was learning to appreciate honesty over kindness. "She reduced your rent the last 2 years before she died," I said, having discovered this in the estate ledgers. "You were struggling with the harvest." "Aye, she did," Mrs. Ashford replied. "Said she'd rather have good tenants than full coffers, that land was meant to support the people who worked it. Your gran understood that wealth means nothing if you're the only one prospering while everyone around you suffers." I thought about Marcus's obsession with appearing successful while never actually being generous, and wondered how I'd mistaken that for sophistication. Eleanor had been truly wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money, and I'd abandoned her wisdom for a man who'd measured his worth in leased cars and rented houses. That evening, Marcus appeared at Thornfield again, drunk this time and shouting obscenities from beyond the gates. James called the police while I watched from the library window, feeling nothing except weariness at the predictability of his deterioration. By the time the officers arrived, Marcus was weeping and pathetic, begging me to take him back because Claire had thrown him out and his sister wouldn't let him stay anymore. I obtained a restraining order the next morning, and Mr. Pemberton assured me it would be enforced. "He's spiraling," the solicitor said. "Men like him often do when they realize they've destroyed the best thing they had." But I hadn't been the best thing Marcus had. I'd been a woman he'd convinced to shrink herself, and the version of me he'd fallen for had never really existed in the first place. What he was mourning was his control, not his love, and I refused to waste sympathy on that distinction. The estate accounts that night made for grim reading. Even with Nina's marketing ideas and James's careful management, Thornfield needed immediate capital injection to survive. The crowdfunding campaign we'd launched had raised £12,000, which felt simultaneously miraculous and hopelessly inadequate against the £400,000 we actually needed. My mobile rang at midnight with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Miss Ashford." A man's voice, professional and smooth. "My name is Richard Thornbury. I represent a London development company, and would like to make you an offer for Thornfield Estate. £4 million, cash, immediate completion." I sat in Eleanor's library surrounded by her books and her journals and her ghost, and listened to him explain how they'd convert Thornfield into luxury flats, how I could walk away wealthy and unburdened, how I'd never have to worry about money again. When he finished, I asked, "And the tenant farmers?" A pause. "Would be relocated, naturally. The land would be repurposed." I thought about Mrs. Ashford's kitchen and Eleanor's principles and the woman I'd been trying to become since Marcus threw me out onto that pavement. "I'll consider your offer," I lied. "Give me a week." I hung up and stared at Eleanor's portrait above the fireplace, and wondered if choosing principle over survival made me noble or simply foolish. I didn't sleep that night, turning the developer's offer over in my mind like a coin I couldn't quite bring myself to spend. £4 million would solve everything. Let me start fresh somewhere without the crushing weight of responsibility and decay. It would be the practical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that proved I'd learned something from 7 years of making myself small for Marcus. Except it would also mean destroying everything Eleanor had built, displacing families who'd worked this land for generations, and becoming exactly the kind of person who measured worth only in pounds and pence. I'd spent 7 years being someone I wasn't for a man who'd never deserved it. I refused to spend the rest of my life being someone I despised for money I didn't actually need. Nina argued for practicality when I told her about the offer over breakfast. Scarlett, you can't save the world by bankrupting yourself. Take the money, do something meaningful with it elsewhere. But James said nothing, just looked at me with those assessing eyes and waited to see what I'd choose. I think he already knew, had probably known since the day I'd walked back through Thornfield's gates with my hastily packed suitcase and my dignity wrapped around me like armor. I visited Eleanor's grave for the first time since her funeral, standing in the village churchyard where generations of my family had been buried beneath weathered headstones and overgrown ivy. Someone had been maintaining her plot, keeping it clear of weeds, and I suspected James, though he'd never admit it. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," I said to the granite marker that bore her name and the dates that bracketed a life well lived. "I'm sorry I chose him over you, over this, over myself. But I'm choosing differently now, Gran. I'm choosing the hard path, the one you would have taken." The wind moved through the churchyard yew trees, and I felt something settle in my chest that might have been peace or simply acceptance of the struggle ahead. I called Richard Thornbury that afternoon and declined his offer. He increased it to $5 million on the spot, then 6, his voice getting sharper with each refusal until I finally said, "Mr. Thornbury, Thornfield isn't for sale at any price. Please don't contact me again." Instead, I launched a crowdfunding campaign that Nina helped me design, pitching Thornfield's restoration not as my personal project but as preserving heritage and community. I shared my story carefully, leaving out Marcus's name but keeping the emotional truth of reclaiming what mattered after losing yourself in someone else's vision of who you should be. The campaign struggled at first, raising perhaps £50 a day from strangers who appreciated the sentiment more than they trusted the execution. Then a local newspaper picked it up, running a feature titled "Heiress Fights to Save Historic Estate After Marriage Collapse," and suddenly we were regional news. The article brought Oliver Grant to my door, a documentary filmmaker with intelligent eyes and a proposal to film Thornfield's restoration journey. He was perhaps 35, thoughtful in his questions, and genuinely interested in the human story beneath the crumbling Georgian facade. "People connect with transformation narratives," he explained over tea in the library. "Not just the building, but you. What made you realize you deserved more than what you'd settled for?" I didn't have an answer yet, but I agreed to let him film because Nina was right that we needed exposure and because something about Oliver's directness reminded me of Eleanor's refusal to accept comfortable lies. The crowdfunding hit £150,000 by the end of the week, and while it wasn't enough, it was a start. It was hope measured in small donations from strangers who believed broken things could be made whole again. Oliver's first interview went live online, and I watched myself on camera admitting I'd lost years trying to be someone else's version of acceptable. The comments filled with women sharing similar stories, and I realized Eleanor had been right about something else too. We're never as alone in our struggles as we convince ourselves we are. Thornfield came alive with the chaos of restoration over the following months, filled with contractors and craftspeople and volunteers who'd been moved by the documentary's early episodes. I worked alongside them, stripping wallpaper and clearing gardens and learning traditional plastering techniques from a 70-year-old master craftsman who'd worked on the estate 40 years earlier. James taught me proper estate management this time, no longer skeptical of my commitment but demanding I learn everything correctly. We walked the tenant farms together, discussed crop rotations and drainage issues and the delicate balance between preservation and progress. His respect, when it finally came, felt earned rather than inherited. Oliver's cameras captured everything, and through his lens I started seeing myself differently. He filmed me covered in plaster dust, laughing with volunteers, arguing with James about sustainable farming practices, sitting alone in Eleanor's library at midnight surrounded by account books and hope. "Why did you stay with Marcus so long?" he asked during one interview, the question gentle but unflinching. "I thought about it carefully, wanting honesty over performance. Because I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, and I didn't understand the difference between sacrifice and erasure. He criticized me constantly, always disguised as concern. I was too fat, too thin, too opinionated, too quiet. He controlled our finances, our social life, every decision. And I let him because I thought making myself smaller was what good wives did." The documentary episodes released weekly online, each one reaching hundreds of thousands of viewers. Messages flooded in from women sharing their own stories of lost years and hard-won reclamation. Scarlett became something I hadn't intended, a symbol of choosing yourself after choosing wrong for too long. Marcus's life continued its public collapse in ways that would have satisfied my rage if I'd had any left to spare. He'd lost his job after his affair with Claire violated company policy, been evicted from his sister's flat following some alcohol-fueled incident, and was apparently living in a bedsit in Croydon and working in a call center. Part of me felt sympathy for how far he'd fallen, but a larger part recognized that these were simply consequences of his own choices catching up with him. He tried calling one final time, his voice small and broken on the voicemail. "You've ruined my life, Scarlett. I gave you everything and you destroyed me." I listened to it once, then deleted it, and the closure felt remarkably anticlimactic. Marcus had given me nothing except lessons in what I'd never tolerate again, and his destruction had been entirely self-inflicted. I owed him neither guilt nor absolution. Nina discovered my old paintings in Thornfield's attic storage, canvases I'd completed before Marcus convinced me that art was a hobby not a calling. They were good, surprisingly good, full of emotion I'd forgotten I was capable of expressing. She organized a small gallery showing at Thornfield as a fundraiser, despite my protests that no one would pay for work I'd abandoned a decade ago. The opening night brought 100 people to Thornfield's restored ground floor, locals and supporters and press intrigued by the documentary's growing audience. My paintings sold for more than I'd dreamed possible, raising £30,000 for restoration and proving that the parts of myself I'd abandoned were still valuable. Oliver found me in the garden afterward, away from the crowd and the congratulations that felt overwhelming. "You're different than when we started filming," he observed. "Better or worse?" I asked. "Just more yourself," he replied, and something in his expression made my breath catch. But I wasn't ready, not yet, and when I told him that honestly he simply nodded and stayed beside me in comfortable silence. I was learning that good men didn't push, didn't demand, didn't try to reshape you into something more convenient. They simply made space and waited to see who you'd choose to become. 6 months after that humiliating afternoon on the pavement, Thornfield had transformed from crumbling liability into something recognizably magnificent. The east wing was structurally sound, the roof no longer leaked, and the gardens had been cleared enough to reveal the bones of Eleanor's original design. We weren't finished, not remotely, but we were undeniably winning. The gallery opening was Nina's idea, a proper event to showcase my rediscovered paintings and raise final funds for the holiday cottage's conversion. She'd invited everyone who mattered, local press and documentary followers and the community that had watched me slowly remember who I was supposed to be. I stood in Thornfield's entrance hall, restored to its Georgian glory, surrounded by canvases that documented my emotional journey through paint and texture. They were raw in ways that made me uncomfortable, grief and rage and hope rendered visible for strangers to judge. But they were honest, and I'd learned that honesty mattered more than comfort. The paintings sold faster than Nina had projected, fetching prices that would have seemed impossible when I'd abandoned art to become Marcus's diminished wife. By evening's end we'd raised £43,000, enough to complete the cottage conversions and book our first guests for spring. Mrs. Ashford bought the largest canvas, a turbulent seascape I'd painted the week after obtaining the restraining order against Marcus. "Your gran would have loved this," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "She always said you had steel in you, just needed the right fire to forge it properly." I was laughing with volunteers near the restored fountain when Marcus appeared at the garden entrance, sober for once but no less pathetic. The crowd noticed him immediately, conversations dying as everyone turned to witness what would happen next. He'd lost weight, his cheap suit hanging badly on a frame that had shrunk along with his circumstances. "Scarlett," he said, loud enough to carry across the garden. "Please, can we talk? I've made mistakes, but so have you. We can work this out, start fresh." Before I could respond, James materialized beside me, solid and protective. Then Nina on my other side, fierce in designer heels. Mrs. Ashford moved to block Marcus's path, followed by a dozen others who'd watched me rebuild myself brick by careful brick. "You're not welcome here," James said simply, his voice carrying the weight of collective judgment. Marcus looked at the human wall between us, searching for weakness and finding none. "You've turned everyone against me," he said, but the accusation lacked conviction. "No, Marcus," I replied, surprised by how calm I felt. "You did that yourself. Now please leave before I call the police." He left without further protest, diminished and irrelevant, and I felt absolutely nothing watching him disappear down the drive. Not satisfaction, not pity, not even curiosity about where he'd go next. He'd become a stranger whose opinion no longer had the power to shape my understanding of my own worth. Oliver found me later in Eleanor's library, sitting in her favorite chair with a glass of champagne and the peaceful exhaustion of survival. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," I said, meaning it completely. He sat across from me, documentary cameras finally switched off, just a man who'd spent months filming my transformation and somehow become part of the story himself. "I'm finishing the documentary next month. After that, I was thinking of staying in the area, maybe taking on some local projects." "Were you?" I asked, recognizing the careful way he was offering himself without demanding anything in return. "I was wondering if you'd have dinner with me," he said. "Not as filmmaker and subject. Just as Oliver and Scarlett." I thought about Marcus's demands and manipulations, the way he'd made every interaction about his needs disguised as our relationship. Oliver was offering something entirely different, a question with no wrong answer, space for me to choose freely. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." 2 years after the taxi ride that changed everything, I stood in Thornfield's gardens during the annual Eleanor Memorial celebration and barely recognized the woman I'd been when Marcus threw me out onto that pavement. The estate had become what my grandmother always envisioned, a thriving community hub with holiday cottages booked months in advance, a farm shop selling produce from our tenant farmers, and event spaces that hosted everything from weddings to art exhibitions. But more importantly, I'd become someone I actually liked, someone who'd been rebuilt from humiliation into something stronger and kinder and infinitely more real than the diminished wife I'd played for 7 years. Marcus had requested a meeting through his solicitor 6 months earlier, claiming he wanted to apologize properly. I'd considered refusing, but Nina convinced me that closure required facing him one final time from a position of strength rather than avoidance. We met in a cafe in Cheltenham, neutral territory where neither of us held power. He looked older, worn down by consequences that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own choices. The call center job had become management, he'd completed therapy, and he seemed genuinely remorseful in ways that might have mattered if I'd still been invested in his redemption. "I was threatened by everything you were," he admitted over coffee neither of us touched. "Your background, your education, your potential. I spent 7 years trying to cut you down to a size I could manage, and I convinced myself I was helping you become more grounded. I forgive you, Marcus," I said, meaning it. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of carrying anger that serves no purpose." We parted without drama, 2 strangers who'd once promised forever and discovered that sometimes forever means learning when to let go. The garden party that afternoon brought 300 people to Thornfield, a celebration of community rather than individual triumph. James gave a toast to Eleanor's vision and my stubbornness, his respect now so complete it sometimes still surprised me. Nina announced she'd bought a cottage in the village, trading London's success for something more meaningful. Mrs. Ashford presented me with a painting she'd commissioned, Thornfield rendered in watercolors that captured its transformation from decay to renewal. Oliver stood beside me as the sun set over gardens that bloomed with careful tending, his hand finding mine with the easy comfort of a relationship built slowly over 2 years of genuine partnership. He'd stayed in the area as promised, taking on documentary projects that mattered, becoming part of Thornfield's story without trying to control it. Happy? He asked, the question he'd posed a dozen times since that first dinner 2 years ago. I looked at Thornfield's restored facade, at the community gathered in celebration, at the life I'd built from ruins with help and grace and stubborn refusal to accept that humiliation defined my worth. I thought about the paintings in my studio waiting to be finished, the tenant farmers whose rents I'd kept fair, the women who wrote to me weekly about reclaiming their own abandoned dreams. Yes, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my reconstructed self. I'm happy. Eleanor's portrait watched over us from the library window, and I imagined her smiling at the granddaughter who'd finally come home, taken the long way round, and discovered that sometimes the most important journey is the one that leads you back to yourself. The estate that Marcus thought he'd stolen my future from had actually saved it, and the woman he'd tried to diminish had grown into someone far stronger than she'd ever been when she was trying to be perfect. Thornfield bloomed, and so did I, and that was the only revenge that truly mattered.